In this utterly undignified spectacle that is Brexit, because the stakes are so high, much has been said on both sides that is regrettable. And when the stakes are so high, it is understandable and only to be expected that we may lose sight of the things that we have in common and instead highlight that which divides us. For Brexiteers, it is important to remember that whilst we may have a problem with the institution of the European Union, we have much, very much in fact, in common with the countries that make up that union. They are pretty much all democracies which are governed by the rule of law. Being a democracy has been a prerequisite of membership for the former autocracies of Spain and Greece, as well as all the former members of the Soviet bloc. So it is simply wrong to say that nothing as good has come from the European Union. And credit where credit's due, it deserves respect for that, if for nothing else. Having said that, there has been an impression that the EU has been disrespecting the UK as a nation. Personally, I don't think that's true. What I think is closer to the truth is that the EU has been somewhat baffled by what they think that we actually want. And considering what a dog's dinner Theresa May, with sterling help from Jeremy Corbyn, not to mention the British press, have made of Brexit, it's really not surprising. The negotiators for the EU know that we voted, by a small margin, to leave, but the negotiating position of our representatives, the British government, have led them to believe that we are desperate to remain in the fold. If I was a negotiator for the EU, I would think that the British government were behaving like petulant children. So in a way, I don't blame them. Their position is quite clear. They don't want us to leave because it would be bad for them. But if we are to leave, their position must be that we do not get a better deal out of the EU than we would if we were to remain. So what should we expect from the EU? Well, this is what I expect. I expect the EU to protect the interests of the EU. There is no reason why it should be any other way. For Brexiteers to believe anything else is delusional at best and arrogance of the highest order at worst. I expect the EU to protect the interests of the EU over and above the interests of the UK. Again, it is only right and natural for the EU to put itself first and the leaving partner, the UK, a very distant second, or third, or more. I expect the EU to protect the interests of EU nationals in the UK. Once again, this is only natural and only to be expected in the same way that British nationals might expect the protective cover of their own government whilst abroad. I expect also the EU to give due regard to the interests of British citizens living in the EU. British citizens living in the EU are not enemy nationals, and neither are they illegal immigrants, and should not be treated as such. I expect the EU to seek solutions from Brexit that will benefit the citizens of the EU and, where possible, also the citizens of the UK. Where that is not possible, I expect the EU to favour the interests of its own citizens. I expect the EU to be responsible in its dealings with what will remain, despite everything, a close trading partner and, more importantly, a very close ally. The UK is the first, second or third largest export market for every EU member, without exception. To attempt to force a deal so bad on the UK, to the extent that it will damage this fact, would be an act of folly of unprecedented proportions. I expect the EU to understand that the importance of the institution of the EU, although enormous, pales into insignificance when viewed in comparison with the other example of international cooperation, NATO. Furthermore, I expect the EU to acknowledge that without NATO, there would have been no Coal and Steel Pact, no Treaty of Rome, no German reunification, no enlargement eastwards into the former Soviet bloc, no Maastricht Treaty, no single market, no European currency, and absolutely no European Union in the first place. But there are also things that I do not expect from the EU. I do not expect the EU to grant the UK special privileges. The UK neither deserves nor requires such treatment. I do not, however, expect the EU to attempt to punish the UK for its democratic decision to leave the EU. Such tactics are unnecessary, and considering the trade imbalance between the EU and the UK, are likely to impact the EU far more than they might the UK. I do not expect the EU to attempt to make an example of the UK as a disincentive for other EU nations to follow the same path. Membership of the EU should remain a voluntary arrangement, and the advantages of that membership should be self-evident. Any coercion or implied threats will be recognised as such and will reveal the lack of confidence that the EU has in its own mission. I do not expect the EU to sow discord and disharmony between the UK and its familial neighbour, Ireland, and attempt to prise open old wounds that many have made great efforts, often at considerable political, personal and moral cost, to heal. Despite the well-known historical differences between the UK and Ireland, we are and will continue to be genetically indistinguishable and utterly indispensable from each other, whatever those differences may be. I do not expect the EU to disadvantage its own citizens in order simply to disadvantage the UK. I do not, furthermore, expect the EU to deliberately disadvantage British citizens over and above the removal of any privileges that they currently enjoy as EU nationals. I do not expect the EU to believe that the UK will not be honouring its commitments to other international bodies, such as the United Nations and particularly NATO. Can we hope that the EU will behave honourably, respectfully and dispassionately to this serious fracture in its sense of destiny? Let's hope so. But whilst we can all hope that they will do the decent thing and take Brexit on the chin, can we expect the British government to deal fairly but firmly with the EU? It's rather late in the day to hope that our political class might do us proud, but you know, hope springs eternal and all that. So what should we expect from the British government? Well, that's a video for next week.